Some actors played tough. These men were tough before they ever stepped in front of a camera. One of them survived one of the bloodiest battles in the entire Pacific War and was one of only 6 men out of 247 in his unit who came out alive. Another was demoted 7 times by the Marines, spent 41 days in military confinement, and then saved 5 men from drowning in the Arctic Ocean before anyone ever knew his name. And the man waiting at number 1 on this list, the one you're going to want to see, walked onto a burning tank destroyer, alone, wounded in both legs, facing an entire company of German soldiers, and held them off for an hour, by himself. These are the 10 toughest actors in Hollywood history, and stay with me, because by the time we reach that number 1, you'll understand why no one who has ever studied this list disputes it. Number 10, Robert Mitchum. Before Hollywood ever put a camera in front of Robert Mitchum, life had already given him an education that no drama school could replicate. Born in 1917 in Bridgeport, Connecticut, Mitchum lost his father when he was just 2 years old. By his early teens, he was on his own, literally riding freight trains across Depression-era America as a teenage drifter, not for adventure, not for stories to tell later, but because he had no other options. He worked in coal mines, he dug ditches, he took any brutal physical job that would keep him fed. He was arrested for vagrancy in Georgia at the age of 16 and sentenced to a chain gang, from which he eventually escaped. That's not a line from a script, that was his adolescence. By the time Mitchum found his way into films in the 1940s, he was already a man who had absorbed more real hardship than most people encounter in a lifetime. And it showed in every single frame he filmed. That famous heavy-lidded, sleepy-eyed stare that became his signature on screen was not a performance choice. Co-stars described it as unsettling, not because he was loud or aggressive, but precisely because he wasn't. He had the absolute calm of someone who had been in real situations where raising your voice would get you killed, and who no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone in any room. In 1948, at the height of his early stardom, Mitchum was arrested for possession of marijuana and sentenced to 60 days at a California prison farm. By any conventional calculation, that should have destroyed his career. He served the time, walked out without a word of apology or explanation, and went directly back to work. His popularity actually increased. The studios panicked. The audience didn't care. They understood, instinctively, that this was a man who didn't bend. When asked once about his approach to acting, Mitchum deadpanned that he had 2 techniques, with a horse and without a horse. Director Edward Dmytryk, who worked with him on multiple films, once said that you didn't really direct Robert Mitchum. You kept the camera rolling and stayed out of his way. The broken nose was real, the scarred face was real, and the stare that made audiences uncomfortable in the best possible way, completely, entirely real. Number 9, Charles Bronson. Charles Bronson was born Charles Bukinski in 1921 in Ehrenfeld, Pennsylvania, the 11th of 15 children in a Lithuanian immigrant mining family. He was working underground in the coal mines at the age of 10, not as a child laborer in the loose sense, but doing the actual physical work of extraction, hundreds of feet below the surface, in conditions that broke men twice his size. He reportedly wore his older brother's used mining clothes to get hired because his family owned only one set of clothes fit for that kind of work between them. Coal dust and darkness and physical endurance were not metaphors in Bronson's childhood. They were Tuesday. When World War II came, Bronson traded one dangerous environment for another. He served as a tail gunner on B-29 Superfortress bombers flying missions over Japan, one of the most exposed and dangerous positions in the entire air war. He was wounded in combat and earned a Purple Heart. When he came home, he worked as a short-order cook, picked crops, and took any job available before eventually finding his way into acting through the Philadelphia Academy of Music. When Hollywood found him, he was already in his 30s, and directors noticed something immediately. His punches looked different from every other actor's. They looked efficient. They looked like punches thrown by someone who understood exactly where to place them to end something quickly. That precision came from a childhood and a war that had nothing to do with choreography. When the Mafia allegedly sent death threats to the studio during the production of Death Wish, producers offered Bronson a security detail. He declined. He told them he had lived too long and seen too much to be frightened by a letter. No one who knew him doubted that was exactly what he meant. Number 8. John Wayne. John Wayne is the most iconic figure in the history of American cinema, and the toughness behind that image was far more real than most people ever knew. Born Marion Morrison in 1907, He grew up in the California desert and earned a football scholarship to the University of Southern California not through privilege but through the kind of raw physical work ethic that defined everything he ever did. His early years in Hollywood were not glamorous. Before anyone offered him a leading role, he was hauling heavy equipment, building sets, and doing the physical labor nobody else wanted. The man audiences would later watch stride across the screen with complete authority spent years doing unglamorous work in silence before anyone was watching. His on-set pain tolerance became the stuff of legend. During the production of The Alamo in 1960, Wayne cracked several ribs performing a stunt on horseback. He wrapped his torso, kept his mouth shut, and kept filming. When director Henry Hathaway offered him a stunt double after major surgery, Wayne looked at him and said, "Either I do my own stunts or you get someone else." That was not a dramatic line. That was a statement of fact about who he was. But the true measure of John Wayne's physical endurance came in stages. In 1964, doctors removed an entire lung and 4 of his ribs after a cancer diagnosis. Most careers end there. His didn't. Months later, he was back on a film set performing physically demanding scenes as if the surgery had been a minor inconvenience. What followed was even more haunting. During the filming of The Conqueror in 1954 in the Utah desert, the production was located downwind from a United States nuclear testing site. Of the 220 people on that production, nearly half would later develop cancer, including Wayne himself. He died of stomach cancer in 1979. He never stopped working. He never complained publicly. Kirk Douglas, who disagreed with Wayne on virtually every political position imaginable, said this about him: "Disagree with his views all you want, but do not question that man's toughness. I have seen him work through things that would put most men in a hospital." Number 7. James Cagney. James Cagney stood 5 feet 5 inches tall. He weighed around 150 pounds at his peak. And virtually every serious student of film history agrees that he was one of the 2 or 3 most explosive physical presences ever captured on camera. Cagney grew up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in the early 1900s, one of the roughest neighborhoods in one of the toughest cities on earth at one of its most violent periods. He didn't box as a hobby or for fitness. He boxed because the alternative in his neighborhood was getting broken by someone bigger. Those early years carved something into his reflexes that no acting teacher could install. What made Cagney's screen presence so distinctive was something that director Raoul Walsh, who worked with him extensively, confirmed directly. Cagney knew how to throw a punch better than any actor Walsh had ever worked with, because he had thrown plenty of real ones before anyone was paying attention. But there was a second element to Cagney that his rivals simply did not have. He was also a trained dancer, a professional one. And that combination, a street fighter's instincts and muscle memory fused with a dancer's timing, spatial awareness, and physical control, produced something on screen that looked unlike anything audiences had seen before. His violence had rhythm. His aggression had precision. He could choreograph menace with the timing of someone who had spent years in front of an audience, and the impact of someone who had spent years surviving a neighborhood that did not forgive weakness. Bob Hope, who knew Cagney for decades, once said that he was the kind of man who would knock you down, then help you back up and buy you a drink. His toughness never faded with age. It refined. It became something quieter and therefore more commanding. Cagney proved permanently that genuine physical authority has nothing to do with size. It has everything to do with certainty. Now, if you've been watching since the beginning, this is a great moment to subscribe to the channel. We're just past the halfway point of this list, and the stories still to come are the ones most people have never heard in this kind of detail. Subscribe and stay with us. Number 6. Anthony Quinn. Anthony Quinn was born in 1915 in Chihuahua, Mexico, during the Mexican Revolution, a detail that sounds almost theatrical until you understand that his family was literally fleeing active combat when he came into the world. His father was Irish-Mexican and rode with Pancho Villa's forces. Some of Quinn's earliest memories were of gunfire and soldiers moving through the streets. His family eventually crossed into the United States and settled in the slums of East Los Angeles, where Quinn's childhood was defined by a kind of poverty and physical hardship that left permanent marks on his body and his character. He was working as a butcher's assistant by the age of 9. He was a construction laborer shortly after. And when money got genuinely desperate, Anthony Quinn climbed into professional boxing rings and absorbed real punches from real fighters for real money. That broken nose he carried for the rest of his life, he did not acquire it from a prop department. He earned it the hard way. The hands that directors later noticed were unusually powerful on film sets had been shaped by a childhood that never offered anything easy. His physical capabilities became famous in Hollywood. While shooting Zorba the Greek, he carried massive logs across beaches that production staff said normally required 2 men. During the filming of The Guns of Navarone, at the age of 46, Quinn performed his own cliff-climbing sequences and dismissed the insurance concerns of the studio with a wave of his hand. What separated Quinn from nearly every other physically imposing figure on this list was his complete comfort with vulnerability. He could weep on screen with total authenticity. He could show fear, grief, and tenderness with the same credibility that he showed raw physical power. That combination, genuine strength and genuine emotional openness, came from a life that had demanded both, often at the same time. Number 5. Kirk Douglas. Kirk Douglas was born Isur Danielovich in 1916 in Amsterdam, New York, the only son of illiterate Russian Jewish immigrant parents who arrived in America with almost nothing. His childhood was marked by a poverty genuine enough that food was sometimes uncertain and the future was always unclear. He worked odd jobs from early childhood to keep his family afloat, and he clawed his way into college through competitive wrestling, not theatrical wrestling, but the real collegiate variety where strength, endurance, and pain tolerance determine everything that happens on the mat. When World War II arrived, Douglas enlisted in the Navy and served on submarine chasers, small, highly exposed vessels that hunted enemy submarines and faced constant danger from torpedo and gunfire. He was wounded in service and medically discharged in 1944. He never used it as an excuse for anything. When he reached Hollywood and began the career that would produce Spartacus, Paths of Glory, Lust for Life, and dozens of other films, his work ethic on set reflected everything his life had taught him. For Spartacus, he trained alongside actual fighters and took genuine hits in combat sequences. When a serious fall during filming left him injured, he was back on set within 48 hours. But the most extraordinary display of what Kirk Douglas was made of came in his 70s. He survived a helicopter crash that killed 2 other people. He recovered, walked again, and resumed his life. Then in 1996, he suffered a severe stroke that robbed him of his ability to speak. What followed was years of exhausting speech therapy. He regained his voice. He wrote a book about the experience. He continued to work, to speak publicly, and to live fully into his 80s and 90s. Douglas died in 2020 at the age of 103. Stanley Kubrick, who directed him in Paths of Glory and Spartacus, once said simply, "When Kirk decided something was going to happen, it happened." That was not a compliment about his screen presence. It was a description of his character. Number 4. Lee Marvin. On June 18, 1944, during the American assault on Mount Tapachau and the Battle of Saipan, a machine gun round tore a 9-by-3-inch hole through the lower back of a 20-year-old Marine named Lee Marvin, severing his sciatic nerve. Seconds later, a sniper's bullet hit his foot. He lay pinned on the ground, unable to move, watching the second sniper shot land approximately 3 inches from his face. He later wrote to his father, "If I got up and ran, I would not be writing this letter, so I just kept down." He was eventually carried off the battlefield and spent 13 months in naval hospitals. The doctors told him he had come within a fraction of being permanently paralyzed. Of the 247 men in his unit that day, 6 came out without being killed or wounded. Lee Marvin was one of the 6. He was awarded the Purple Heart, a Presidential Unit Citation, and multiple campaign medals. He tried to re-enlist after his discharge and was turned down on medical grounds. He ended up working as a plumber's assistant at a community theater in upstate New York, where someone asked him to fill in for an absent actor during a rehearsal, and that was the beginning of everything else. When Marvin arrived in Hollywood, something was immediately apparent to every director who worked with him. He moved differently. His economy of motion, the way he occupied space without needing to announce himself, the absolute stillness he could produce, these were not acting techniques he had studied. They were the physical habits of someone who had learned on a Pacific island that unnecessary movement gets you killed. When he played soldiers, hitmen, or dangerous men of any kind, there was something in his eyes that most actors simply cannot manufacture. He wasn't pretending to know what violence looks like. He had seen it up close, from the ground, with a hole in his back and a sniper's second shot 3 inches from his nose. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery when he died in 1987, next to professional boxer Joe Louis. Number 3. Steve McQueen. Steve McQueen was abandoned by his father before he was born and by his mother when he was still an infant. He was raised by a great uncle in Missouri, then sent back to his mother in California, then sent to a reform school for troubled youth in Chino Hills at the age of 13 after his stepfather declared him incorrigible and had him committed. He ran away, he joined street gangs, he drifted. He joined the Merchant Marines as a teenager and jumped ship in the Dominican Republic. He eventually enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in 1947 at 17 years old and proceeded to be demoted from private first class to private not once, but 7 times for infractions ranging from going AWOL to spending 41 days in military confinement after being captured while absent without leave. 7 demotions. The Marines broke every other man who behaved that way. They did not break McQueen. And then, during a training exercise in Arctic waters, a personnel carrier broke through the ice and began to sink. Steve McQueen pulled 5 men out of the vehicle before it went under. 5 men, alone, in freezing water. After that, he was assigned to the Presidential Honor Guard and served out the remainder of his military commitment, protecting the presidential yacht of Harry S. Truman, honorably discharged in 1950. In Hollywood, McQueen treated danger the way most people treat a mild inconvenience. He performed nearly every stunt himself, against the explicit objections of studios and insurance companies who understood exactly how much money they stood to lose if he was hurt. He raced motorcycles and cars professionally throughout his career, entering events under a pseudonym, Harvey Mushman, so that studios couldn't stop him. In 1970, at the 12-hour Sebring race, he and his co-driver Peter Revson finished second overall against professional factory racing teams. McQueen drove the entire race with a broken foot and a cast. He had the pedal modified and sandpaper glued to the sole of his shoe so he could work the clutch. He finished second in one of the most grueling endurance races in America with a broken foot, just 23 seconds behind the winner. When he learned that his name had appeared on a list associated with the Charles Manson investigation, McQueen did not hire additional security. He began carrying a loaded firearm wherever he went and continued his life as normal. He died in 1980 at the age of 50 from mesothelioma, a cancer he traced to asbestos exposure during his time removing pipe insulation on a troop ship in the Marines. His own military service gave him the cancer that eventually took his life. He remained the highest-paid actor in the world for a significant period of his career and was working on a comeback at the time of his diagnosis. Number 2. Charlton Heston. Charlton Heston served as a radio operator and aerial gunner in the Army Air Forces during World War II, flying B-25 Mitchell bomber missions in the Aleutian Islands, a theater of war that combined brutal cold, almost constant cloud cover, and the relentless threat of enemy fire and mechanical failure in equal measure. He came home from that service with a physical and psychological discipline that never left him, and he brought it to a career that became one of the most physically demanding in Hollywood history. For the 10 Commandments in 1956, Heston carried actual stone tablets, not prop replicas, but real stone, for take after take in the desert heat, without complaint. For Ben-Hur in 1959, he trained for months with professional chariot drivers in preparation for the race sequence that remains one of the most dangerous sustained stunt sequences ever filmed. He took genuine falls during production, sustained real injuries, and returned to work. During The Greatest Story Ever Told in 1965, he tore shoulder ligaments performing a scene, had the injury wrapped during the lunch break, and was back in front of the camera that same afternoon. And then there was The Conqueror. Heston, like John Wayne, was part of the 220-person cast and crew who spent weeks filming in the Utah desert downwind from the Nevada nuclear testing site. Like Wayne, like a staggering number of others on that production, Heston later developed cancer. Unlike Wayne, he survived it. He had a lung removed and continued to work. He continued to perform physically demanding roles. Moses, Michelangelo, General Gordon, Andrew Jackson, roles that required real physical conviction and the kind of endurance that no actor could fake over a career spanning 5 decades. He was also a devoted advocate for civil rights in the early 1960s, marching alongside Martin Luther King Jr. before it was a popular position to hold in Hollywood. Whatever one may think of his later political positions, the courage in his convictions was never in doubt. Number 1. Audie Murphy. When Audie Murphy appeared at the gates of a major Hollywood studio for the first time, the security guards didn't believe who he was. This quiet, boyish young man, barely 5 feet 5 inches tall, who weighed around 112 pounds when he enlisted, did not look like the most decorated combat soldier in the history of the United States Army. He looked like a high school student who had gotten slightly lost. The studio called inside to confirm. Murphy waited patiently while they checked. He was born in 1925 in Kingston, Texas, the 7th of 12 children of a sharecropping family that was so poor his father eventually abandoned them entirely. His mother died when he was 16. Murphy dropped out of school in the 5th grade to work and help feed his younger siblings, hunting game with whatever firearm was available and developing a marksmanship that would one day be studied by military historians. When the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor happened in 1941, Audie Murphy tried to enlist immediately. The Marines turned him down, too small, too young. The Navy turned him down. The paratroopers turned him down. His sister eventually falsified his birth date on an affidavit to get him past the Army's age requirement. He was accepted in June 1942 and assigned to the 3rd Infantry Division, with which he would serve for the entire war. What followed over the next 3 years reads like something constructed specifically to be disbelieved. Murphy fought in 9 major campaigns across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany. He was wounded 3 times. He spent approximately 400 days in frontline combat. He received every American Combat Valor Award available, including 5 additional decorations from France and Belgium. In total, 33 military decorations. He was promoted from private to 2nd lieutenant through battlefield commissions, which means he earned his officer's rank not in a classroom but in the middle of active combat, because the men around him were dying and someone had to lead. But the single moment that defines what Audie Murphy was happened on January 26, 1945, near the French village of Holtzwihr during the Colmar Pocket Offensive. His company of roughly 120 men was attacked by a German force including 6 tanks and a large number of infantry. Murphy ordered his men to withdraw to the tree line. Then, instead of going with them, he stayed, alone. An M10 tank destroyer nearby had been hit by German fire and was burning. The crew had abandoned it. Murphy climbed onto the burning vehicle, which could have exploded at any moment, and manned its .50 caliber machine gun. He directed artillery fire by radio with one hand while firing the machine gun with the other, targeting the advancing German infantry from the top of a tank that was on fire. He was shot in the leg during this. He continued firing. He held off that German assault by himself on top of a burning vehicle for approximately 1 hour. He killed or wounded around 50 German soldiers in that action alone. When he finally ran out of ammunition, he climbed down, rejoined his men, refused medical attention, and organized a counterattack that drove the Germans back. Producers who later made a film of his life, To Hell and Back, in 1955, in which Murphy played himself, reportedly toned down the actual events of his service because test audiences said they were too extraordinary to be believable. The real story was considered too heroic for a Hollywood script. Murphy later spoke openly about the severe post-traumatic stress that followed him for the rest of his life. He slept with a loaded firearm. He suffered nightmares and flashbacks for decades. He became one of the earliest and most prominent advocates for veterans' mental health, speaking publicly about his own struggles at a time when that kind of disclosure was considered deeply unusual for a man of his reputation. He was introduced to Hollywood by James Cagney, who had seen his photograph on the cover of Life magazine after the war. Murphy went on to appear in more than 40 films. He wrote country western songs. He bred quarter horses. He continued to advocate for veterans until the end of his life. On May 28, 1971, he was killed in a private plane crash in Virginia at the age of 45. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. Per his own request, his headstone was left plain and unmarked by gold leaf, the same as any ordinary soldier, even though the regulations for Medal of Honor recipients call for gold decoration. That detail, more than any other, tells you exactly who Audie Murphy was. His grave is the 2nd most visited at Arlington National Cemetery. The most visited belongs to President John F. Kennedy. Every day, people walk past presidents, generals, senators, and Supreme Court justices to stand in front of the plain, unmarked headstone of a sharecropper's son from Texas who weighed 112 pounds when he tried to enlist, and who became the most decorated soldier in the history of the United States Army. That is what real toughness looks like, and it has nothing to do with what you see on a screen. Now here is the question I want to leave with you. This list covers men who fought wars, survived poverty, raced cars at professional level, and spent time in prison, and they all became Hollywood legends. But if you had to pick just one, the man on this list whose story genuinely surprised you the most, who is it? And do you think Hollywood today could ever produce men like these? Or was something about that era simply impossible to replicate? Drop your answer in the comments. Subscribe to the channel. We'll see you in the next one.